going to talk today about our history, and you're going to hear from me a lot of things that you have never heard before. Before our land was invaded, we had a great civilization, and I wrote down some of the things that we had and the Europeans had in 1492. The Europeans, number one, were engaged in wars with each other that raged off and on for untold centuries. The animosity probably dated back to the time when they began to develop their cultures. This war-making mentality caused them to work constantly and to expend much of their resources to invent armaments that they could use more efficiently to kill one another, which by 1492 made them the best armed people in the world. Thus, when they used their horrendous war-making capabilities on the indigenous citizens of the civilizations of the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Australia, it was no contest. The people of these continents were slaughtered with impunity and their properties confiscated. Number two, they were ruled over by brutal aristocrats who often plotted against and schemed against one another and often unseated a ruling relative and executed him or her. They used humans as work animals, slavery. Women and children were not much more than chattels of men. 5, had corrupt judges and magistrates convict persons, many of whom were innocent of what they call capital crimes such as murder, theft, witchcraft, heresy, etc., and then executed them by burning at the stake, hanging, decapitation, pressing, and other barbaric methods. These executions were public affairs, and public attendance of citizens at them was often mandatory. To add to the efforts to keep their citizens terrorized and subservient, the heads of the executed were often placed on display on spikes on bridges and other locations, and the bodies of the hanged were often left for crows and vultures to feast upon. They had bedlams where living conditions were mostly abhorrent, were created to host the mentally ill, and many sane unwanted relatives of heartless individuals were often interred in them. The main functions of these establishments was to segregate, not to cure. Some aristocrats took pleasure in visiting them on Sundays for entertainment. Debtor prisons were used. Families of debtors were often left to starve. I included an instance of such in We Were Not the Savages that happened at Annapolis Royal. Starvation and malnutrition were common among the poor. 9, they were castrating young boys with sweet voices to preserve their voices longer for the enjoyment of the aristocrats and the empowered. 10, greed. Although professing to follow the teachings of a Christian God, greed for the accumulation of worldly goods and power over others were the main motivating factors propelling European culture forward. 11 were members of a class system that mandated that the lowest levels bow and scrape and pay homage to their betters, level by level up to the king and queen who had only God above them. The older people among us can tell you that at one time, if we wanted something from the Indian agent, we had to practically get down our hands or knees and beg them for it and call them sir, and they called some of our elders like old Bill or old Sarah or something like that. Was no respect. Now I'll tell you about the Mi'kmaq. Much more, by the way, can be added to that European list. Number 1, leaders served at the pleasure of the people. You could be kicked out of office or you could stay in office for your lifetime. But if you wanted to stay in office, you had to behave because the people had the last word. 2, had child care. Adoptions and women and children were treated with respect. If a couple didn't click, divorce was available. That I really got a kick out of it because I was reading about an old missionary way back in the old days in The Mi'kmaq chief had a little debate on this subject, and the Mi'kmaq chief was confounded by the stupidity of this man, who thought if a couple got married and they, began to hate one another, that they should stay together till they died. And he told the missionary, he says, "You make no sense. She hates me, I hate her. She could love him, I could love her, and we'd all be happy." And that's part of the record. Number 4, honor and sharing were the cornerstone of the society. Greed was practically unknown. And that's one of the things that enabled the Europeans to take over our lands so easily, is another trait that our ancestors had. They shared, and they had no comprehension of greed. Food was plentiful. No one went hungry. And our ancestors, before they came, invaded, had one of the highest standards of living in the world. I often read about them commenting, some of these missionaries and British officials and French officials, in their diaries about meeting Mi'kmaq that were well over 100 years old. It wasn't unusual. And when you take in mind that the average life span of the Europeans at that point in time was around 35 years, it was quite an accomplishment. There was no slaves among our people, no burning at the stake, no hangings, no bedlams, no debtor prisons, none of that. Didn't need them. And the Mi'kmaq worshipped the Creator who was kindness incarnate. And that Creator was worshipped 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, not only on Sunday at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock when the Mass was held like there are other Christian services. And above all, there was no class systems. People were considered equal among equal. If you got any perks in that society, you had to earn them. They weren't given to you because of a position. If you held the office of chief, you had to earn the people's respect to get to that office to begin with. You didn't get elected by the people just because you were a handsome cat or whatever. You had to have some substance. My conclusion is when Europeans invaded the Americas and used the following rationale for their barbaric behavior, they had a Christian duty to civilize the indigenous people of the two continents. It was a case of the uncivilized, unless one uses the ability to conduct warfare and inhuman warfare mentality as standards of civility. They were trying to civilize the civilized. The uncivilized were trying to civilize the civilized. It's unbelievable when you're reading some of these records, it's sometimes I used to be laughing because they'd actually discuss some of the good qualities of Mi'kmaq society. And then they would wonder, how can these savages be more civilized, act more civilized than we, the civilized? I think what we have to do as people, we have to learn our own history. I'm going to tell you a bit about myself. I was born in 1938. And by the way, I'm a little hard of hearing, so after I'm done talking, I'm going to set up over here and I'll have a few books. If anybody's interested in buying them, I'll be selling them for $20 a piece today. I can't let that go. But I'm not here to sell books in particular. I'm here to talk about us. What we had before they came is probably irreplaceable. But when I read some of their things, for instance, at a funeral, the Mi'kmaq would gather, and what they would do, they would set aside 2 or 3 days, and they would talk about the good qualities of that individual and discuss it constantly for 2 or 3 days. And it was a very civilized way to do. In doing so, they, helped the people with their loss to grieve and everything else, but they also knew at the end of the day that somewhere along the line that they would all join one another in the land of souls and be happy. It was a different type of civilization altogether. I don't think we'd ever be able to recreate it in this day and age. You've got too much greed, too much jealousy, too many the sins of Europeans have been adopted by our people, unfortunately. What we have to do, though, is begin to come together more often and enjoy the company of our elders and our younger people. There was great civilizations in the Americas. They went from all the way from hunter-gathering, like the Mi'kmaq were, to people living in great cities. Actually, when you're reading this book, 1491, you'll really find it outstanding that you'll see where the conquistadors were walking down this city in Central America, the streets of the boulevard of this city, and it had beautiful buildings and it was spotless clean. And at that point in time in Europe, if you were to go to London or Paris or Madrid or Rome or one of these cities, you would find open city sewers, and these places were filthy dirty. But here these conquistadors were like country yokels going to a city for the first time and seeing a city with running water, absolutely spotless. It was clean beyond belief. When you hear these old tales about the civilized Indians that I encountered when I was young, I want to give you a little of my history. I didn't start school until 1947 when the Indian Day School opened at Shubenacadie. And at that point in time, we had the nuns, Sisters of Charity, as teachers, and the priest was the principal. These people came, and most of them believed in the stereotypical view of the Indian as a savage that had no culture, no civilization. And one teacher in particular, one nun in particular, was so frightened to be among Indians that she had to be sent back to the mother house in Halifax. But my first education there about ourselves, our history at that point in time had a little paragraph about that long, and what it said about the Mi'kmaq was that they could make axe handles, baskets, and they were pretty good at it. And that was the total. We were taught by these people that if we wanted to succeed in life, we had to adopt the white way, which was the right way. And we couldn't make it without doing so because we came from a savage culture. Why did I write we were not the savages? Because I went away from home with an inferiority complex that was huge, where people were telling us when you were small that you were not as good as the white men around you, the white folks around you. Then you began to build into you an inferior complex. And I went to Boston when I was 14 and ran away from home and went to Boston and got jobs in various places over the years. I didn't get in touch with my mother until I was 16, and she couldn't make me come home. And then I called her up and told her where I was. And then when I was around 18, I was working in a hat factory, and there was this black lady from Mississippi working there, a middle-aged woman, and her and I used to get in some talks from time to time. And one day she called me over and she said, "Sit down, boy, I want to talk to you." She said, "You walk around this room with your head down and you act like, you think that everybody around you is better than you, that these white folks are better than you." And she says, "Well, I want to tell you something." She said, "You're just as good as they are, and probably in many cases far, far better." And then she told me about, segregation. She came from the South when segregation was running and racism was running blatant down there. And I told her about our treatment, at the hands of the Indian agents and all this stuff. And she says to me, she asked me a question. She said, "What do you know about your people, your history?" And I stopped and told her, well, not much. I said I had heard of, treaties and scalp proclamations. And the main reason I heard about scalp proclamations because occasionally the provincial government used to put bounties on the heads of porcupines or something, and someone would make a crack, where the poor animal was being treated as bad as the Mi'kmaq. And with this kind of knowledge, I said, I really don't know nothing. And then I made up my mind that day that I would eventually learn something about our people. So when I was 21, I returned home and I applied for admission to a business college in Truro, and I only had grade 8, and the principal took me in anyway. And I went to the Indian agent, and this is the kind of racism we faced from them. And I asked him for assistance to go to this school, and a lot of white people run around with this nation think that we had education at our fingertips anytime we wanted it when we were young, which we didn't. I went to the Indian agent and asked him for assistance, and this is what he told me. Why don't you get a pick and shovel and do what you're best suited for? And that's the kind of attitude we had to deal with. I did go to business college and I graduated. And then I was offered an opportunity by Noel Doucette, an old friend, to help him put together the Union of Nova Scotia Indians. And I thought it over for a few days, and then I told Noel, no, I think I'll try to learn more before I get involved in something like that. So luck would have it in 1971, Rod Brown, the regional director of Indian Affairs, was setting up a district office in Halifax, and he called me up and asked me if I would go to work there. And after he called me 3 times, I agreed that I would. And I spent 14 and a half years at the Department of Indian Affairs, and I can tell you I saw more racism in that department than anybody can believe. It was like a circus. And one employee who wasn't racist, one Caucasian, one white employee who wasn't racist used to tell me, one day you're going to write a book about this. And I used to laugh at him and say, really? I saw practically everything that could be said in there. I saw a bunch of them one day. I'll just tell you this one. We had offices that had spaces up above, and it was a beautiful March day, and the sun was shining, and it appeared it might be warm out, so I decided I would take my newspaper and lunch and go over to the parade square and maybe sit there and eat. But when I got outside, I found it too cold. But there was a corner office where they used to all get together and have a good talk and eat their lunch. None of them seen me come back, and I sat in an office next door. And I spent 15 minutes not reading my newspaper, but listening to them. And what they had to say about our people was enough to damn them to hell. Too bad I didn't have a witness, but I did get up and I did walk into the office, and you probably could have heard a pin drop from Halifax to Montreal. They didn't know what to say. And I told them, well, I heard everything you had to say, and if you want to know who the biggest welfare recipients are in this country, it's the employees of the Department of Indian Affairs who are doing nothing, including the whole damn virtue in this room. And they didn't know what to say. They were totally speechless. So anyway, I had the last say. They didn't speak to me much for about 4 or 5 months after. They were too embarrassed. But it's things like that that brought me around to it. What I learned was that we had to tell our story. And it wasn't going to be told for us by the white man. We had to do it ourselves. So I decided I would write that book. And I'd done a lot of research, and I had the able assistance of Mr. Donald Julian, who helped me with a lot of the things. I uncovered the scalp proclamations. There was actually 3 scalp proclamations that were issued for the Mi'kmaq, including men, women, and children. The first one was in 1744, when the fort at Annapolis Royal, the Mi'kmaq had it surrounded, and Mascarene the English governor, sent to Governor Shirley in Massachusetts for assistance, and Shirley responded by declaring war upon the Mi'kmaq, and in that declaration he put a bounty on the heads of Mi'kmaq men, women, and children. Then in 1749, the British sent Edward Cornwallis to Halifax to set up the town that is today known as Halifax, and asked the Mi'kmaq to come in and sign treaties. And that proposal he made to them, that they had to own the King of England as their sovereign, that they would have to acknowledge that the King of England owned all our land, and from that point on they would have to obey British law. The Mi'kmaq chiefs refused, and on, I believe it was September 23rd, 1749, they renewed their declaration of war against the British. And at that point in time, Cornwallis convened a meeting of his military government aboard HMS Beaufort out in Halifax Harbor, and they decided that they would issue a bounty for the heads of the Mi'kmaq, again, Mi'kmaq men, women, and children, with the intent of exterminating the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, period. And that was something that he wrote to the powers that be in London, and he stated the fact that that was his intent, that it would be better to root the Mi'kmaq out once and forever. And by the way, at that time, New Brunswick was part of Nova Scotia, so he was all intent. It didn't work. The Mi'kmaq fought back, and finally Cornwallis left. But the thing is, there was 2 attempts to exterminate our people, and yet these men that did it are honored by society today as heroes. When you put a bounty on the head of women and children, you really have no salvation, in my opinion. But anyway, I'm here to talk about things that are done to us. Here's a book by Thomas H. Riddell. He's a man that is widely honored, one of the greatest authors in the world. He wrote this book, Roger Sudden, and it's supposed to be a historic novel about between 1749 and 1758 in Halifax. And the guy is named Roger Sudden. And in that book, I was shocked beyond belief when I read it. I often heard that our ancestors, warriors, when they were out fighting, they used to take the heads of the victims. And I couldn't figure out where in the name of God that stupidity came from. And I couldn't imagine a warrior going out and maybe killing 10 enemies and trying to run through the woods, and escape with 10 heads. That would be quite heavy. It's in this book. This Roger Sudden, this Thomas H. Riddell, has it in there that they did take the heads. That's where it came from. There's no evidence whatsoever anywhere that could substantiate that declaration. He also lays it down pretty quickly that Chief John Bettis Cope was an old barbarian who was a bloodthirsty killer, and Roger Sudden goes to battle with him and kills him. No, it doesn't kill him, he knocks him unconscious. And his wife, Cope's wife, comes out and drags him back to the wigwam and stabs him to death. And that never happened. John Bettis Cope signed the Treaty of 1752, and that was the one that enabled us today to get together in these settlement deals and what have you. It began the process that got us to where we are. It went to court, and in 1981, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the 1752 treaty was a valid treaty, and that's where we began to do our battle and win court cases. We have a long way to go, and I'm proud of the fact that we're making a lot of progress, But I want you to take this and give it a lot of thought. It's my last statement, and it's simply this. When I was executive director with the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq, I hired on a young man to be construction supervisor. And I wanted him to get his papers so he would be an inspector, would be able to make valid inspections. And I told him that he had to take the test. So he went and he applied and he got accepted. And then he came in and told me, he says, "Danny, I cannot take the test." And I said, "Why can't you?" He says, "Because there's 50 of us taking the test and 49 of them are white men." And I said, "Well, what's the difference?" He says, "Well, if I'm a only Indian," he says, "I'm going to come out 50th. And I get the hell out of here. You'll either take the test or you wouldn't be working here. Either one, take your choice." And he reluctantly went out and took the test. And then 2 weeks later, I saw him coming toward my office, and he had a grin on his face from ear to ear, and he had the results of that test. And that test, he came out number 1, not 50. And I told him, I said, just because people for our lifetime have told us we're stupid, we don't have to believe it. We have the same intelligence as any other peoples in this world, and if we make up our mind to do something, we can damn well do it, and we can do it ourselves. And this is what our future will need to be. We have to get to the point where we have our own engineers, our own doctors, our own accountants, and the whole thing, where we do our own thing, and we do not have any more white folks coming in doing it for us. We do our own work. And I think that day we're slowly moving in that direction, and hopefully it would be too long. And like I said, I'm a little on the deaf side, so I'm going to sell some books today, and I'll be down in that corner. And I would take no questions because I wouldn't be able to hear you. So all in all, I hope I gave you some information that'll let you think for a while. And keep in mind always that we come from a people that I'm so very proud of. The lady that I mentioned from Mississippi that told me what she told me, I'll tell you one thing, I look back at that and she changed my life because she just taught me one thing in an instant, and that is something that I'll always go with, that I'm as good as anyone. Thank you very much.